And first of all, I'd very much like to thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to speak on disability, as you can see from my first slide, and talking to some of my staff who've been coming to these conferences for some years. I gather last year disability didn't get mentioned at all, whereas this year there have been several speakers who've been talking about it. And for me, that's brilliant to see that disability is now coming to be seen as a very important issue around inclusion and diversity. Now, you may not all know who Sightsavers is. I'm not going to do a great pitch for us, but just so that you understand, we're an international charity. We're based in the UK, but actually most of our staff work across Africa and Asia. We've got nearly 600 people now altogether, so we're very much an international workforce. In all those countries, it's nationals who run those offices, not expatriates. So automatically we have an ethnically diverse workforce. We do what it says on the tin, rather, Sightsavers. We do a lot of work around eye health, but we're also very passionate advocates for the rights of people with disabilities. And we work very closely with disabled people's organisations to amplify their voices when they're fighting for equality. Now, I'm very optimistic at the moment around disability. It's a topic which previously just wasn't featuring in the international discourse, but now it's being talked about everywhere. And it was particularly good to see that in the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed in 2015, disability runs like a golden thread through them. It's not really possible to achieve any one of those SDGs unless you also achieve it for people with disabilities. And it's hardwired into those goals that people must disaggregate their data. So they must show, are they achieving for women? Are they achieving for people with disabilities, etc.? So that will mean no longer can governments or organisations kind of do the easy bit. So what would tend to happen is they would go for what they would call the low-hanging fruit. And the people who were always left out were the marginalised people, and particularly people with disabilities. Now, as a result of those SDGs and a lot of effort and shouting, we have got some really positive results coming through. The British government is actually, within its international development group, spearheading a lot of great work. They have their own disability framework, which is more about how they manage internally. They recently championed a very big global summit on disability, which was full of people with disabilities and co-organised by the International Disability Alliance. And they're investing very large grants in looking at what works to make sure people with disabilities are included in development. So, hey, that's all good, isn't it? Great news. And we in Sightsavers have been doing an enormous amount of work to make sure that we include people with disabilities in all our programmes, not just running special programmes for people with disabilities. So one of the things we realised, we support a lot of eye health programmes, so cataract operations, glaucoma treatments, but could somebody who was using a wheelchair actually access those hospitals? How ironic was it that there we are championing disability, and yet our own programmes are not necessarily accessible? So we're doing a lot of work on that side of things to make sure that our programmes are inclusive. And we're doing a lot of campaigning. We have a campaign running called Put Us in the Picture. And that is talking to governments, to World Bank, the UN, all of them saying, whatever work you do, whatever development you undertake, whatever funding you make, you must ensure that people with disabilities are included in that. And we've had a lot of success. This is actually Lynn Featherstone, who's a Lib Dem who got voted out a while ago, but who was actually a real champion of disability rights. And what's happened there was DFID refused to replenish the huge Global Partnership for Education Fund unless they guaranteed it would include people with disabilities. So we've been hugely pleased at all that success. However, we then sort of had to stop and think and thought, well, but is Sightsavers itself really properly inclusive? Are we actually doing what we should be doing? Are we walking Are we walking the talk? Are we practicing what we preach? Or are we at risk of being accused of hypocrisy? And I'm not satisfied, not remotely satisfied, with the number of people that we have in our organisation with disabilities. Now, we recently did an anonymous staff survey, and we do those every 2 years. And although we're improving, we're still nowhere near good enough. And we did also do a review of all the people we do have with disabilities and asked them what they thought. And I was a bit shocked to discover that about 20–25% of them did not wish to identify or tell us that they had a disability. Now, we are Sightsavers. We champion disability. And if you don't feel comfortable and safe in that environment to share that you have a disability, where would you feel safe? And what are we doing wrong? So we've decided to make a really, really strong effort in this area. And we have a number of people who are really helping us champion that. I mean, there's one here today, Kate Burnell, and she's worked with Sightsavers now. Oh, goodness me, Kate, it's nearly 20 years, I think. Now, in the early years, Kate opened the Post. She did a whole bunch of menial things. Because everybody assumed that, well, that's what somebody with a disability can do, isn't it? And nobody actually stopped and thought, well, actually, Kate is extremely intelligent. She's got a huge amount to offer. And why on earth have we got her just doing something menial? And we find that across our organisation. People will offer people with disabilities token jobs just so they can say, we have somebody with a disability. Kate now, she's been writing her blog for a long time. She does public speaking, represents us in meetings, organises the social inclusion working group, speaks to our board, tells them off when they don't, make sense. So this is the sort of thing I mean where we're not good enough, but we're trying harder. So what we've done, we have introduced this working group, but we've got a whole series of things that we're trying to do. We are doing training sessions for all of our staff. I've had this training as well, which is going through a whole range of issues about working with people with disabilities and also answering some of the questions that people are afraid to ask. And quite often, people are not being difficult, they're not being unpleasant, they're afraid of causing offence. And so sometimes they just avoid people with disabilities because it's easier. Simple questions like, well, oh my God, I said to James, see you tomorrow, but he's blind, I've upset him. Well, that's very rarely the case. Or do I crouch down to talk to somebody who's in a wheelchair? Or is that patronising? But then if I'm talking, am I talking down to them? What should I do? Very straightforward questions that people can then talk about and answer and hopefully become more comfortable in that environment. This is an example of a training session we did in Pakistan. And it's been extraordinarily well received. It includes some very straightforward discussions around the use of language. Now, I would have to say to you that some of the language we come across, particularly in Africa, is horrendous. It's language not been used in this country for decades. So we've had to overcome some of that. But for me, this is a lovely example explaining the difference between equality and equity to somebody. And for those who can't see this, the first cartoon, there's 3 people of different heights standing in front of a fence, and they're all standing on an equal-sized box. So that's equal. But actually, only one of them can barely properly see over it. If you have equity, you have different sized boxes. So you're providing the kind of support that's actually needed so all of them can see over the fence. And then finally, you get rid of the fence. So you've actually got rid of the barrier that was the problem in the first place. And then we have a whole pile of practical recommendations and advice for people. And you'd be surprised sometimes how some of these things are not actually fully recognised by people. So what we've done is we've done a very comprehensive training package for the entire workforce. We've also introduced a whole series of speakers who come and they talk. They come, obviously it's in the UK, but we stream these live out to people in the other offices. This is an example of a woman who has Usher's syndrome, which means that you're born profoundly deaf, and then over the next sort of 10 to 15 years, you also go blind. So it's a very challenging condition. And she was talking to us about the importance of assistive technology and all the tools that she needed in order to be able to be fully included in society. An incredibly impressive woman, Molly. So again, that's helping our staff see the shared experience and get a better empathy and understanding of people with disabilities. And then what we're also doing is we are working with other campaigns. This is a great lady here. It's a woman called Caroline Casey. She used to be on our board. She has severe visual impairment. It's called ocular albinism. So she can't really see very much at all. But she is an unbelievable woman. She's crossed India on an elephant and Colombia on a horse and all kinds of completely intimidating things. But what she's now doing is she's running a great campaign for business, saying business should include people. And they should include people not because it's just the right thing to do. It's not entirely a values-driven thing. And that's why she uses the #valuable moniker. Now, in fact, Accenture, very recently this year, published a study that showed that businesses that include disabled people properly would actually do far better. And in fact, the figures showed that they would double their income. Now, that's incredible. So it's not just about rights-based approaches, important that those may be. There are hard-nosed business reasons for doing this too. And that's why she calls her campaign valuable. These are valuable people, it's valuable to your business. So we're also working with her as part of our DFID grants to try and see how do you better empower people with disabilities across the world, within our workforce and externally, and to make sure that they feel properly valued. Now, what I'm hoping is that in a few years' time, we will be an employer of choice for people with disabilities, that the people who work with us feel valued, feel that they can make a real contribution, and they're not just there so that when I publish my statistics in my diversity report, I can say, look, it's all right, we've got plenty of them. That's not good enough. So that's what I'm hoping for. But what I would just like to end with, if we can play the video, is I asked a few of our staff, what does it mean to you? What do you think Sightsavers should be doing? So this is just a very, very short video. Do you not have it? I'm not clever enough in the technology to include it actually in my slideshow, so I sent it separately, but not to worry if you can't find it. Essentially, we have three guys who all have different disabilities. One is colourblind, which is an example of a disability that is hidden. And that's the other thing I think people often forget. Disabled people are not necessarily using a wheelchair. They're not necessarily carrying a white stick. They often have a disability that you can't see. We have another guy who has had several bouts of cancer, which technically makes him disabled under the Act. And that's something he doesn't really like to talk about very often, but has made him very aware, particularly as a manager hiring people in, how to be sensitive. And finally, we have a woman who, she's absolutely amazing. Her name is Gertrude. She's a 60-year-old Ghanaian woman who I couldn't possibly do justice to here on the stage. Unbelievably driven. She's totally blind and has been for many years. And she was voted recently onto the UN committee that oversees the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability. Now that itself, going to a different diversity issue, originally that committee was 18 people and there was one woman on it. So we did a campaign, #EqualUN, to try and do something about that. And we were very successful because in the next round, 9 women were voted on. And one of them was our own Getty, who's there banging the drum for Africans, for women, and for people with disabilities. So thank you all very much.